Maria Williams stood silently in the small, austere courtroom, the low hum of murmurs around her nearly drowned out by the sound of her own heartbeat. She wore a modest gray suit, her expression calm but resolute. The judge, a man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed mustache and an air of quiet authority, glanced over the paperwork in front of him, not once making eye contact with her. He cleared his throat, his gavel ready to drop. "Miss Williams," the judge began, his voice measured and firm, "you've been fined in absentia for a missed hearing. The fine for failure to appear in court is $500, and as per the standard procedure, that amount will be applied today." Maria knew better than to interrupt, but the words stung in a way she hadn't expected. To an outsider, this was just another traffic violation case, a simple administrative matter. But to her, the fine was far more than a trivial inconvenience. She'd missed the hearing due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, one that had been beyond her control. But instead of considering her explanation, the judge had only seen her as just another defendant in his courtroom, no different from anyone else who had made a similar mistake. It was a moment that echoed an all-too-familiar feeling, the sting of being underestimated. Though outwardly calm, Maria's mind was racing. She had faced far tougher battles than this, but it was the principle of the matter that weighed heavily on her. This was not just about missing a hearing. This was about perception, about a system that too often brushed aside the challenges faced by women of color in positions of power. The judge, likely unaware of her real identity, had reduced her to just another name on his docket. But Maria knew better. She was far more than that. As the judge went on with his legal jargon, Maria's thoughts flashed back to her work, the long hours spent uncovering layers of corruption within the highest offices of the nation. She had spent years building a reputation as one of the most formidable figures in the federal effort to expose corruption at every level of government and private industry. But none of that mattered to this judge, not in that moment. To him, she was simply another woman who had missed a court date and deserved the penalty. Maria met the judge's eyes for a brief moment, her gaze steady, unwavering. She said nothing as he continued to rattle off his decision. But in her mind, a plan was already forming. This would not end here. Not for her. As the gavel fell with a sharp, final sound, Maria stepped down from the stand. The fine had been imposed, but a spark had ignited within her. This moment, small as it may have seemed to the judge, would be the beginning of something much larger. She would not let the world define her by its expectations, especially when the stakes were so much higher than any courtroom could contain. Maria left the courtroom with the fine still hanging over her, but it was the smallest of her worries. The courtroom door swung shut behind her with a dull thud, but the weight of the judge's gavel felt more like a loud echo in her mind. She had no intention of letting the $500 fine be the focus of her day or her week, for that matter. She had bigger things to worry about, much bigger things. As Maria walked through the courthouse hallways, her mind shifted to the fight she had been leading for years, a fight far beyond the confines of this small city. For over 5 years, she had worked tirelessly at the helm of a federal task force dedicated to uncovering corruption in both local and national government. Her team, made up of skilled investigators, analysts, and lawyers, had been instrumental in breaking open some of the most significant political and corporate scandals in recent memory. Whistleblowers trusted her, her superiors respected her, and her enemies feared her. But to this judge, she was just another woman in a courtroom. The thought made her stomach twist. She had grown used to being underestimated, to people seeing her only as a woman of color, disregarding the influence she held in her professional life. But she didn't mind. In fact, she learned to use that underestimation to her advantage. Every time someone wrote her off, she used it as fuel to prove them wrong. But this situation, she couldn't help but think, was different. This wasn't just about proving her worth. It was about shining a light on the system itself. The system that allowed a powerful woman to be dismissed so easily. The system that didn't see people like her, who fought for change, as its true heroes. As Maria made her way to her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a flood of messages from her team. She had just missed a call from the director of the task force. Her heart quickened as she tapped the screen to check the voicemail. "Mariah, it's Nathan. We've got a major breakthrough on the Parker case. Meet us at the office, pronto. This could be the one that breaks everything wide open. Call me." Her mind immediately snapped back to the world she had spent years building. The Parker case, a long-standing investigation into a major corporate conspiracy, was one of the most sensitive operations her team had ever handled. It had the potential to expose high-level corruption that reached far beyond the local government, touching influential figures in Congress, law enforcement, and even the White House. She couldn't afford any distractions. Not now. She didn't even hesitate. Mariah slid into her car and drove off, already making mental notes on how to handle this next phase of the case. But as the engine roared to life, one thought lingered in her mind. The fine. She hadn't forgotten it. And it would not be the last time she crossed paths with the judge. The fine was supposed to be just a minor bump in the road, a small inconvenience in the grand scheme of Mariah's work. But soon, it became clear that the consequences of the judge's decision were rippling outward in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started with the media. Within hours of the hearing, a local news station picked up the story of the high-profile defendant who had been fined for missing a court date. The headline blared across screens, "Federal Task Force Leader Fined for Simple Court Mistake." It was a simple enough story at first, but it quickly gathered steam. The questions began to swirl. Why had Maria Williams, a well-known figure in the fight against corruption, missed her hearing? Why was she being fined for something so trivial? And more importantly, who was behind the fine? Maria hadn't been ready for the attention. She was used to being in the background, working behind the scenes to expose corruption at the highest levels. But now, her name was in the news. And the more people dug into her background, the more the story shifted. The public wasn't just curious about the fine. They were starting to question the motivations behind it. Who had decided to target her? And why? Her phone buzzed incessantly as reporters, both local and national, reached out for statements. Some were respectful in their inquiry, but others were less interested in hearing her side and more focused on digging into her personal life. Maria was no stranger to media attention, but this felt different. This wasn't about the work she was doing. It was about her. About her being a black woman in a position of power. Her team, too, was feeling the pressure. Within the next 24 hours, her task force's investigation into the Parker case had gained national attention, with several major outlets reporting on their findings. The exposure wasn't entirely unwelcome, but it added to the growing complexity of her life. Now, not only was she battling the case at hand, but she was also fighting a narrative that was growing around her. A narrative that painted her as someone under scrutiny, someone who could be easily dismissed. But Maria wasn't one to back down. As the inquiries began to pile up, she started to realize that this fine, this small, insignificant moment, was not a personal matter. It was part of a larger pattern she had witnessed countless times. It wasn't just about the judge and the court date. It was about a system that didn't see her for who she truly was. And that was something she couldn't ignore. By the end of the week, Mariah knew this wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about standing up to a system that had long underestimated her, a system that had tried to label her as just another defendant when, in reality, she was a key player in the fight against corruption. It wasn't just a fine. It was a challenge. And Mariah would face it head-on. Mariah hadn't planned on running into the judge again. She had more important matters on her mind. Primarily, the mounting pressure surrounding the Parker case and the growing media frenzy over the fine. But life had a way of throwing curveballs. It came in the form of a closed-door federal meeting, called to discuss the latest findings from her task force's investigation. The room was filled with top-level agents, officials, and politicians who were privy to some of the most sensitive corruption cases in the country. Maria, as always, was the leader of the discussion. She was poised, articulate, and authoritative, commanding the room with every word. The task force had uncovered ties between several high-ranking officials and corporate magnates, and it was time to take the next step in exposing the corruption. As Maria walked into the room, her eyes quickly scanned the faces around her. And then she froze. Sitting at the far end of the table, looking out of place amidst the gathering of seasoned political players, was none other than Judge Richard Moore, the same judge who had fined her just days before. For a moment, she felt a flash of irritation. Of all the people to be invited to this meeting, he was the last person she expected. But she quickly pushed the feeling aside. This was not the time for emotions or distractions. She had a job to do, and the work she was leading had far more weight than any personal grievances. The judge looked up from his notes, meeting her eyes. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that told her he recognized her. The same man who had dismissed her case as just another routine matter in his courtroom was now sitting across from her as if they were equals. The meeting began, and Maria fell into the flow of the conversation, her sharp mind quickly analyzing the details on the table. But all the while, she could feel the judge's eyes on her. Every time she spoke, he seemed to listen more intently, his posture shifting as if he were trying to reconcile the woman before him with the person he had sentenced just days ago. She noticed his discomfort but chose not to address it. She had more important matters to focus on. As the discussion progressed, the judge eventually spoke up, his voice cutting through the room. "Maria," he began, his tone more measured than it had been in court, "I didn't realize the scope of your work. I may have misjudged you." The words caught her off guard. She didn't respond immediately, but her mind raced. He was acknowledging something, perhaps a realization of her influence and power, but it was unclear if he truly understood the weight of his words. Still, Maria remained calm. As always, her response slow but deliberate. "Judge Moore," she said, her voice steady, "there's a lot you don't know about me, but it's never too late to learn." In the days following the federal meeting, Judge Richard Moore couldn't shake the memory of Maria Williams' poised, commanding presence. It wasn't just her intellect that had struck him, nor was it her leadership in the room. It was the sheer weight of her influence, the quiet power she exuded, even in the face of his earlier judgment. The woman he had dismissed as just another defendant in his courtroom was now a national figure, deeply involved in the fight against corruption at the highest levels. The contrast haunted him. In the courtroom, Maria had seemed so ordinary, so calm, even as he handed down the fine. He had not seen the depths of who she was or the far-reaching nature of her work. To him, she had been nothing more than a case file, a minor infraction. But after seeing her lead that federal meeting with such clarity and precision, he realized how much he had missed. That night, he found himself reading through her public record. Maria Williams had been involved in numerous high-profile investigations, uncovering corruption in powerful government offices and major corporations. She had exposed fraud at the highest levels of the financial industry, connected deep-seated political corruption to corporate interests, and even been instrumental in breaking several international criminal syndicates. Her work had saved millions of dollars in taxpayer money and brought down some of the most influential figures in the country. Yet despite all this, he had never heard her name in connection to such significant achievements. The more he read, the more the realization began to settle in. He had made a grave mistake in his judgment, one that could have ramifications far beyond his courtroom. He had seen Maria not as a leader in the fight for justice, but as just another person who had made a minor legal mistake. His previous decision now seemed like a stark contrast to the woman he had met in that meeting room, so composed, so focused on the bigger picture. But it wasn't just about his personal failure. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this moment, the fine, was a small but glaring symptom of a larger problem. Maria was part of a much bigger fight, one that many had failed to even acknowledge. She was a force for change, but she was also an example of how easy it was for powerful systems to dismiss those who didn't fit their narrow views of authority and respect. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about how society often overlooked the very people who were pushing for real systemic change. Judge Moore wrestled with his growing discomfort. He couldn't undo the fine, but he could do something else. He could offer her the respect she deserved. And perhaps, just perhaps, he could start to change how he viewed the world. A world where people like Mariah had to fight harder to be seen for who they truly were. Within days, the fine imposed on Maria Williams snowballed into something much larger than anyone could have predicted. The media, once focused on the fine itself, now pivoted to a wider narrative, amplifying Mariah's stature as a key player in the fight against corruption. News outlets, from local stations to national networks, were quick to turn her story into a compelling one. "The woman fighting corruption is fined for a missed court date" became a headline that felt almost absurd in its simplicity. But it didn't take long before the public started to see a deeper issue. The fine wasn't just about a missed hearing. It became a symbol of how women of color were treated within systems that were supposed to serve all equally. Social media exploded with posts and hashtags, many questioning why such a significant figure, someone who had dedicated her life to exposing powerful figures in government and business, would be treated like any other defendant. The outcry was swift and forceful. Online communities rallied around Mariah, calling for accountability. Advocates for racial justice, women's rights, and civil liberties began to speak out, framing the fine not just as a personal injustice, but as part of a larger pattern of institutional bias. If the system can dismiss Maria Williams like this, how many others are being overlooked or punished unfairly? One influential journalist tweeted, sparking thousands of retweets and comments. People rallied behind her, not because of the fine, but because they recognized the pattern. They saw that Maria had long been fighting not just for the truth, but against systems that undervalued those like her. Her role in the federal investigation into corruption had always been public, but now her story was on the front page of every major news outlet, with people across the nation paying attention to the woman who had been unfairly targeted. Maria didn't back down. Despite the constant barrage of media requests and growing pressure from her team to address the fine publicly, she stayed focused on the larger picture. She knew the attention wasn't about the fine. It was about the fight for justice she had been leading all along. The attention only fueled her resolve. If anything, it made her more determined to finish what she had started. As public support swelled, Mariah continued her work on the Parker case, making significant progress toward uncovering the extent of corruption tied to powerful political figures. She used the spotlight to highlight the larger issues at play. She didn't just want justice for herself. She wanted systemic change. The fine had given her a platform, but Mariah wasn't just going to let it define her. She would use it to bring even more attention to the very systems she had spent her career dismantling. But as the weeks went on, one thing became clear: the fight had shifted. It was no longer just about her or the fine. It had become a battle over accountability, fairness, and the way powerful systems treated people like Maria Williams. As the public uproar over the fine continued to grow, a shift began to take place within the very system that had initially dismissed Mariah. Calls for accountability weren't just coming from the public or the media anymore. They were reaching the very halls of power. The more the media spotlight focused on Mariah, the more uncomfortable certain officials became. Some recognized the implications of the situation. Others simply saw an opportunity to leverage the controversy for their own purposes. But amidst it all, one person saw this as a chance for change, and perhaps more importantly, to make amends for a past mistake. Judge Richard Moore, who had originally imposed the fine, found himself at a crossroads. For the first time in his career, he questioned the authority he had wielded in the courtroom, particularly the assumptions that had led him to dismiss Mariah so easily. The public backlash weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just the media or public opinion that concerned him. He was beginning to see the larger implications of his actions. Maria was a highly respected figure, and he had treated her as if she were nothing more than another face in his docket. One evening, after a long day of sifting through case files and media reports, Judge Moore sat at his desk, staring at the headline that had been splashed across every newspaper: "Corruption Fighter Fined for Missed Court Date." It was a reminder of the moment when his judgment had failed, but also a moment that was now defining Mariah as a symbol for justice and reform. Unable to ignore the nagging feeling in his gut, Moore made a decision. He would meet with her, not just as a judge and defendant, but as two individuals committed to something larger. His intention was clear. He needed to acknowledge the mistake he had made, and perhaps begin to understand the true weight of the fight Mariah was leading. It wasn't just about corruption. It was about the biases embedded in the system, biases that had allowed his own actions to contribute to a larger culture of injustice. The next morning, Judge Moore reached out to Mariah's office, requesting a meeting. It was rare for someone in his position to make such a request, but he was determined to right the wrong he had committed. He didn't expect her to welcome him with open arms, but he hoped that, at the very least, they could have a conversation, one that went beyond their roles in the courtroom. Maria, ever the professional, agreed to meet, though she remained cautious. She didn't know what Judge Moore's intentions were, but she understood that the stakes were higher than her personal grievances. If this meeting could bring about a shift in how the system treated people like her, if it could influence even one judge to reconsider their biases, then it was worth it. They agreed to meet the following week. The day of the meeting arrived, and Mariah walked into the small, understated conference room in the courthouse with a quiet resolve. She had come to terms with the fact that this conversation with Judge Moore wasn't about clearing her name. It was about something deeper. She had spent years fighting for accountability, transparency, and justice in the systems that governed her, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just about the court date or the fine. This was about challenging the very biases and assumptions that shaped those systems. Judge Moore was already seated when she entered, his posture more relaxed than she had expected. There was no gavel, no courtroom formality, just two people sitting across from one another. He looked up, his expression unreadable at first, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. "Miss Williams," he began, his voice steady but with an undertone of humility, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I've been thinking a lot about our last encounter, and I've come to realize that I made a serious mistake. A mistake that I now see as more than just a matter of a missed hearing." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I didn't understand the full scope of who you are or the work that you've been doing. I misjudged you, and that's something I can't ignore." Maria listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She had been prepared for something along these lines, but hearing it out loud still carried weight. She had expected an apology of sorts, but she also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. She had fought too long and too hard to accept anything less than action. "You're right," Mariah replied, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the systems that allow these kinds of mistakes to happen in the first place. It's about how women of color, like myself, are often dismissed or underestimated, how the work we do is overlooked until it's too late." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "It's about how easy it is for people in power to ignore what they don't understand." Judge Moore shifted in his seat, absorbing her words. There was no defense or argument, just the quiet realization that Mariah was right. His world, his position in the judiciary, had been one that protected a status quo, one that had allowed biases like his to persist. But in this conversation, there was an opening. A small one, perhaps, but an opening nonetheless. "I understand that now," he said quietly, "and I want to do something about it. I don't expect you to forgive me easily, but I want to find a way to make things right, not just for you, but for anyone who has been overlooked by a system that should have been fair to them." Maria nodded slowly, acknowledging his sincerity. "The change needs to happen at every level," she said, "and it starts with people like you, recognizing their role in it." The meeting ended on that note, quiet, reflective, but with the unmistakable feeling that a shift had taken place. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The fine couldn't be undone, and the fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time, there was a genuine acknowledgement of the biases that had shaped the system, and a shared commitment to making a difference. As Maria left the courthouse, she didn't feel the weight of the fine anymore. Instead, she felt something more powerful, the feeling that, step by step, the walls of an unjust system were starting to crack, and that, in the end, was the real victory.